Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, is Nicolas Sarkozy about to join the growing list of European leaders who have been ousted by angry voters in economically uncertain times? Now, the victory by socialist François Hollande here in the first round of France's presidential elections this Sunday has sort of reinforced his position as the perceived favorite in the runoff vote that will take place here in France on May 6th. Now, the prospect, and I have to say the prospect of a Hollande presidency would mark a rare victory for the left on a European continent which has mostly recently been veering to the right. And we did see here in France the rise of the far right candidate Marine Le Pen, who scored almost 1 in every 5 votes that were cast this Sunday. So the question we're asking today with my guest, Thomas Klau, welcome to the studio. You are from the European Council on Foreign Relations. You're based here in Paris. You're a senior foreign policy fellow. You've written extensively about European integration, governments, economics, Franco-German relations, just about everything. I want to ask you today, are Europe's tectonic plates shifting? Are we seeing perhaps the old models being challenged? But let's start here in France. Nicolas Sarkozy, a poor showing. He's blaming it on the economic crisis. Is it that, or is it just that the voters really dislike the guy?
Well, you said so in your introductory words. All incumbent governments across the Eurozone since the beginning of that major crisis have faced a problem when they face the voters and have usually been sent packing with not extremist parties returned to government, but the mainstream opposition. And if François Hollande is indeed elected French president on May 6th, we will see the same pattern replicated in France. Now, obviously, Nicolas Sarkozy has a popularity issue. An awful lot of people in France, including people on the right of the party political spectrum,
his own party,
are not comfortable with the way in which he embodies France. The French president, rather like the US president, there is a regal side to the job. And because he's chief executive, but also head of state, people want him to embody the nation in the way he speaks. He smiles and in the mannerisms.
So there was a problem with the French, perhaps not all of them, being able to identify with Nicolas Sarkozy.
That is something which he's addressed himself in a few remarks talking to journalists when he said, yes, I know I've had an issue with not coming across as presidential enough to the tastes of some Frenchmen. He set out as a modernizer, and one of the things he wanted to modernize is the look of the presidency. He deliberately tried to tone down the regal side of it. That's not something that has necessarily played well with the French voters.
And we'll remember here the talk of the la rupture, the break with the past when he first came to power. That said, even though François Hollande did score a victory, it was a narrow victory. And what we did see as well is voters flocking to the so-called fringe parties, whether on the left, but to a much greater extreme on the right. What's your reaction when you see Marine Le Pen of the far-right National Front Party, anti-Europe, anti-immigrant, anti-everything, it seems? What's your reaction when you see that? Is this the dangerous rise of the far right, or just angry voters trying to make a statement about Sarkozy and the political elite?
It's a significant fact. And my first reaction is her strategy has worked. She's inherited the party from her father. She's had to fight for it to some extent. She's tried to portray and project a very different image from that which her father projected when he was party leader and still projects. Her father is notorious in France for flirting with playful references to the Nazi, to Europe's Nazi past.
Called the gas chambers a detail of history.
Absolutely. He compared Nicolas Sarkozy's last big presidential campaign rally before the first round to the Nuremberg Nazi rallies. He's made a number of anti-Semitic jokes, which he's been condemned, and remarks, which he's been actually condemned in court with. She's broken with that. She tried to reach out to the Jewish community in France. She's refrained from any remarks of that kind. In fact, she probably is very different from her father in that she generally finds these sort of things very distasteful. That said, the core message of the party, as you rightly said, remain anti and extremist. Anti more migration, anti-Europe, breaking up the European Union, as we know today. But that refocusing of the message has been important and, as we see, successful. She's managed to keep the hardcore extremist part of the Front National electorate, while reaching out to voters who wouldn't have felt comfortable voting for the party under her father, who obviously feel more comfortable voting for the party now.
So she's put, you could say, perhaps an acceptable face on far-right politics, at least here in France. I'd like to get back, though, to François Hollande. One of his major platform pitches, I suppose, is a return to growth based partially on public spending, more on schools, more on education, while still pledging to get the deficit down. Are we seeing a shift towards the end of austerity? Are voters perhaps saying too much austerity, we're fed up with this gospel is just not working anymore?
No, I think there's an understanding that austerity is needed, or at least a policy that brings down debt and deficit. At the same time, Hollande's push for more being done to foster growth in Europe is obviously popular with a significant proportion of the French electorate.
But not the
not
leaders.
only the French electorate.
Not the leaders.
Well, what we've seen so far, of course, in the Eurozone is a German-inspired drive for a single-minded focus on austerity. But we've seen how that's brought the centre-right, the new centre-right Spanish government, into major difficulties. We've seen Mario Monti, a friend of rigorous public policy on
His
debt and
honeymoon
deficit,
is over.
in trouble now because growth in Italy is underperforming compared against the expectations of a few months ago. So we might be seeing in Europe now a collective consciousness arising, helped along by a change in the Élysée in the French presidency, if there is one, towards a rebalancing of the policy framework, towards a less exclusive focus on austerity, with more being done to stimulate growth.
Now, I mean, you know, you've written a lot about the German model, Franco-German relations. I would take that Angela Merkel is going to be rather resistant to that. I mean, could Angela Merkel be left rather isolated if we do see that focus, that shift away from an exclusive focus on austerity?
Angela Merkel would be isolated, I think, if she offered a President Hollande, if Hollande is elected president, it's not a done deal yet,
We have to say
nothing
yes.
In the negotiations, the difficult negotiations that will be open between France and Germany and the partners after an Hollande victory. But I think people in Berlin are beginning to prepare for an Hollande presidency.
Including Merkel herself.
Including Merkel herself. And they know that they couldn't leave the new French president go back empty-handed. Hollande has actually mentioned 4 proposals on what he would actually ask. Not a renegotiation of the fabled fiscal compact as such,
Right.
but additional measures to provide a broader, more balanced policy framework. And there is much in that.
But wouldn't that is a renegotiation, is it not?
Not a renegotiation of the pact as it is, but the negotiation about new political elements being added to it.
Okay.
And there is much in what he's proposed, which Berlin would be ready to negotiate about, and where, in fact, Hollande might find himself supported and backed by a number of Eurozone partners.
So we might see an accommodation between Merkel and a prospective President Hollande.
Inevitably we will. We might see a few tough meetings, a few difficult weeks or possibly months, but we will see a compromise. I'm absolutely confident that that will happen. And then, in fact, we might see quite a fruitful relationship between the two leaders, because if you look at the personality profiles of François Hollande and Angela Merkel, it's not at all difficult to imagine them getting along much better and much faster than Nicolas Sarkozy did with Angela Merkel.
So that's interesting. The Sarkozy-Merkel, the Merkozy duel, as it was often called here, a slightly artificially forced relationship.
A marriage of convenience, an arranged marriage, if you like. Of course, every German chancellor and every French president have to get along, and it's often a process that takes time, and that starts with a few really difficult months and rocky years before they become used to sharing the same flat
Right.
and kitchen and God knows, other rooms. But again, if you look at personality, and chemistry isn't everything, it's working even when chemistry is difficult or almost impossible to achieve, as it was between Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. But if chemistry comes on top of the necessity to cooperate, then
you have the perfect
fruitful.
recipe for cooperation. In the little time we have left, European institutions, a big issue here, both the EU and the Eurozone institutions. Would you see him once again? I'm going to just put the emphasis on François Hollande. He is right now the perceived front-runner. Do you see him as being EU-friendly? Would he be someone who would help strengthen European frameworks and institutions?
Well, every French candidate who becomes president becomes, of course, a bit of a Gaullist, just because of the trappings of power and the substance of power located in the Élysée. But if you look at François Hollande, the politician, he comes from the Delors school of European and French socialist politics. And he's more agnostic or less hostile, less contemptuous of federal European institutions like the European Commission or the European Parliament than Nicolas Sarkozy is.
So he might be more inclined, say, for budget tax harmonization within the EU.
He might have a more Euro-friendly attitude than the French president.
Briefly, we have time for one more question here. You recently wrote an article in which you basically said on the eve of this the first round, France doesn't deserve this. You said that this campaign has lacked that honest, analytical debate that the French people deserved. What would you have liked to have seen the candidates talking about?
I would have liked to see one of the two leading candidates, and ideally both, rising above the difficulty of having to cater both to the France du Nord, the one that voted no to the Constitutional Treaty, and the France du Oui, the people who voted in favour of the Constitutional Treaty, and go before the voters and say, this is my plan for France, France and Europe for the next 5 years. These are the changes to Europe's functioning which I think need to happen. And I'm not just going to focus on little bits which I want to attack or praise. I'm going to come up with a comprehensive, coherent project, proposal and view. Vote for it, vote against it. But if you vote for me, having done that, you know that this is what I'm going to do. Nicolas Sarkozy did that in 2007 when he said, I'm going to push for the Lisbon Treaty, what became the Lisbon Treaty, after the failure of the Constitutional Treaty. And he had a popular mandate for it. He hasn't had that courage this time, nor has François Hollande had the courage so far. Let's see what happens between now and the second round.
And I would bet, perhaps, just to have that final word, that perhaps the economic crisis is going to intervene to weigh on some of those judgments and whether that debate actually happens. Thomas Clow, we unfortunately have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, head of the Paris office. Thanks very much for sharing your views today on this French election and the possible consequences for the rest of Europe.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.